works.
Okay, thank you.
There you go.
Right, thank you. It's a bit like ours. Okay, good. Thank you very much. Thanks, Andrew, and good evening, everyone. And welcome to this evening's meeting at last. And special welcome to visitors to Kenton. You're very welcome, and it's great to see you. There may well be those of you on this call who have relatives who were on the domestics visa scheme. If you have, I wonder if you would mind letting us know using the chat function. Be interesting to know how many people there are here who have that connection with tonight's talk. And it's a great pleasure to introduce Jennifer Craig Morton, Dr. Jennifer Craig Morton. Jennifer's, as it said in our flyer, is an honorary fellow of the Parkes Institute at the University of Southampton. The Parkes Institute is named for the Reverend Dr. James Parkes, who died in 1981, who was an Anglican clergyman, a historian, and a social activist. James Parkes was also a pioneer in the study of anti-Semitism, and also a pioneer in the reshaping of Christian attitudes towards Jews and Judaism. Jennifer has been involved, has a teaching background, and she has been involved in Holocaust education since 1999, when she became a United States Holocaust Museum Teacher Fellow. She has completed, as you can see, a PhD, and her PhD was centered on Kindertransport, and the PhD was, as I say, was awarded to her for that work by Southampton University, and that was followed by a much acclaimed book, The Kindertransport Contesting Memory, which was published in 2019. Jennifer has been researching this fascinating but wholly unknown, it seems, story of the young women who were able to escape the Holocaust by coming to the United Kingdom on a domestic visa. And that's going to be the subject of her talk at long last. But just before she does begin, I just want to give a personal thank you to Jennifer. About an hour ago, hour and a half ago maybe, Jennifer was giving a talk, similar talk, to the University of London, zooming in over there. So she's had a busy evening, and I'm delighted, Jennifer, that you're able to spare us the time to come and give this talk to us. So enough, over to you.
Okay, first I need to share my screen here. The host needs to enable screen sharing so I can show my PowerPoint. So whoever the host is needs to do that.
Michelle?
And while we're waiting for that, I just want to thank everyone for being here. Let's see. Okay. Rachel, you need to somehow enable screen sharing. I'm not sure how you do that as the host. Can anybody help Rachel here?
It's Rochelle's screen, we can see.
Oh, it's Michelle, I'm sorry. All right, so somehow you have to enable screen sharing.
We can see us here in screen share.
Where is she?
Rochelle, are you okay with all this? You need to click on the up arrow to screen share, and then just click that multiple persons can share their screen, and that should do.
Yeah, it's a little green arrow down at the bottom. Down at the very bottom of the screen, Rochelle, there's a black bar. If you hover your cursor down there, you should see participants chat and share screen.
And stop the share screen, Rochelle. Stop the screen share. You'll be able to do it. It's Rochelle. Hello, Roy. Hello, Roy. Am I muting? Oh, okay.
Yes, you could set me as a co-host, and that would enable me to share the screen. So in there we go. We got it.
David, can you ask everybody please to mute
There we
themselves?
go. I think we're good, huh? Let me see. Let me get me.
People are unmuted. There's-
All right. Can everyone see the screen now?
No.
Yes? The PowerPoint, is it up?
No.
Only see Rochelle's screen.
It says I'm screen sharing. I can see it.
Rochelle is muted. She needs to.
I'm going to try and see if the rabbi knows what to do.
All right.
Rochelle, it's Karen here. You need to stop. I'm trying to call you. You need to stop your screen share. And if you stop your screen share, it will be fine.
Ah, okay. It's okay now.
Can you see the PowerPoint?
Yeah, I can see Forgotten Exiles.
Okay. Hopefully all the other participants can as well.
I hope so. If I can, I'm sure everyone else can.
All right.
I can see it.
Well,
Now,
you seem to be in business.
okay. So I can't see anyone or myself, but that's not a problem at all. I don't know if someone turned my video off, but
I
that's
can see you.
perfectly
I
fine.
can see you, Jennifer. That's fine.
What was that?
I can see you clearly. It's fine.
Okay. If you can see me, that's fine. I
Yes.
can't see myself, but that's perfectly all right.
Yeah.
All right. After that brief interlude, let's begin. Anyway, thank you all for being here. It's absolutely fabulous that there's so much interest in Jewish refugee domestics. And I'd like to thank David for inviting me to give this talk, and thank the rabbi and all of Kenton Synagogue and all of your guests for being here tonight. As I said, I'm very gratified to see such an interest in refugee domestics, which have largely been overlooked in the scholarship and in public memories of Britain in the interwar period and the Second World War. At least 20,000 refugee domestics came to Great Britain in the late 1930s, accounting for over a third of all the pre-war adult refugees allowed into this country. Yet only one British scholar, Tony Kushner, has written about them at any length. Kushner has focused on British immigration policies that allowed these refugees to enter the UK, and has also written analytically about some of the literature they have left behind. But to date, there has not been a single book in English that explores their lives as refugees and servants based upon their own testimonies, memoirs, and papers. My own research aims to rectify this situation by examining the experiences of refugee domestics from their pre-immigration lives to the ways in which they coped with a singular refugee experience of being required, indeed compelled, to become domestic servants in exchange for the chance to escape Nazi persecution. My research utilizes unique archival sources, as well as over 300 testimonies and memoirs that were written and recorded later in the former refugees' lives. And I'd like to begin with a quote from the testimony of a woman named Lisa Hoffman, who offered her own explanation for the permit that allowed her to leave Germany in 1939. Then suddenly, the British Home Office was issuing so-called domestic permits, whereby females could go to England and do nothing else but domestic work. It wasn't, perhaps this doesn't sound very grateful, it wasn't entirely altruistic of the English to do that. They had great problems to have servants because at that time they really exploited their maids. There was always that class distinction, and they really took terrible advantage of them as a rule and underpaid them so that slowly their own people didn't want to do domestic work anymore. And so this was a marvelous opportunity for them to import some servants. And meanwhile, of course, it saved my life. Here, Lisa Hoffman highlights a number of themes that run through the testimonies of former refugee domestics: tensions between gratitude and bitterness, questions about the altruism of the British, comments on the treatment of servants, and observations about class. Her comments also address the very reason the British government was willing to allow such a large number of Jewish refugees in the country. At a time when immigration policies were so strict that almost all other refugees, adults and unaccompanied children alike, had to have financial guarantors and were strictly forbidden to seek work. Lisa Hoffman's remark that the British had great problems to have servants accurately reflects a reality in the interwar years that was commonly referred to in Britain as the servant problem or even the servant crisis. After the First World War, a complex mix of sociocultural factors led working class girls to resist entering domestic service at the same time as a rising middle class raised the demand. Most British homes were extremely labor intensive to run, and modernization had, ironically, been hindered by the ubiquity of servants. Additionally, servants were important signifiers of status, and the middle classes, in their relatively modest homes, where they interacted more intimately with their one or two servants, were usually the most rigid enforcers of the class distinctions that demanded servants know their place and behave accordingly. Throughout the interwar period, British housewives increasingly turned to foreign domestics, and by the 1930s, there were perhaps 10,000 German, Austrian, and other European women who were not Jewish working in British homes. After the Anschluss of March 1938, the Home Office instituted a visa requirement for anyone coming from the German Reich, which led to the formation of the Domestic Service Visa Program. Now, refugees who wanted domestic visas had to first secure a firm job offer, and the newspapers were filled with ads placed by prospective domestics, as seen in the middle of the slide here. Prospective employers had to apply to the Ministry of Labor for a permit, as you can see on the left-hand side, having previously proven that they had been unable to find a British person for the position. Once a job was secured and a permit granted, the prospective servant then had about 3 months to get all the necessary exit documents and permissions before they could leave the Reich. And that's what's going on in the piece of correspondence on the right. Many chose domestic service as a stopgap measure so that they could live in safety and support themselves while waiting for an American or an Australian or another type of visa. Throughout 1938, the majority of applicants were Austrian, as the Anschluss had proven such a shock that Austrian Jews immediately clamored to emigrate wherever they could. And it really wasn't until after Kristallnacht that a large number of German women tried to obtain domestic visas. In 1939, when demand became overwhelming, the government handed the task of arranging the permits to the Central British Fund's Domestic Bureau, which had been created in the summer of 1938 and was headquartered in Bloomsbury House. Not the Central British Fund, but the Domestic Bureau itself had been created. And they eventually convinced the government to allow 400 visas per week to be issued to British consulates abroad, enabling refugees to obtain a domestic permit without first having secured a guaranteed position. These women were said to have come over on a green card and were required to register at Bloomsbury House upon arrival and immediately look for work. The photograph in the center of this slide shows women looking at job postings at Bloomsbury House, and many testimonies discuss the daily task of presenting themselves there with hundreds of others to be looked over by a parade of prospective employers. Domestic service permits were open to any woman 18 to 45, though by late 1939, even women in their 50s and girls 16 and over had been included in the scheme. In mid-1939, the government also allowed a small number of married couples to apply for domestic positions. Herman and Tina Mandel, one of these couples, described the preparations they were making. My employers are rich Aryans. We'll live in our own house on the estate, where there are apparently lots of technical jobs for me to do. I'm also learning to be a butler, and in the evening, all the inhabitants of our flat have to sit around the table while breakfast and dinner are served and cleared away with great enthusiasm. Similarly, the correspondence of Adolf and Gisela Adler, a childless couple in their early 40s, includes the notes they took on the formal arrangements of cutlery and dishware for each meal they were expected to serve in their British employer's household. Another couple, Hildy and Gerard Gerard, reflected on their experiences in a short memoir written in the 1980s entitled We Were Lucky. We heard that the consul was very critical of friends of ours who had clean and unspoiled hands, questioning their ability to do housework. After that tip-off, we scraped carrots and peeled potatoes, and after a few days, our hands were ingrained with dirt, and we had no difficulties on that score. Nevertheless, the vast majority of domestics were single women, most under the age of 30. They came from rural and urban areas and from religiously observant and secular homes, but by a wide margin, they came from comfortably well-off professional families who had, until Nazi policies forbade it, employed live-in servants themselves. A surprising number were only children, and many described themselves as spoiled, naive, and sheltered. In testimony, they recall idyllic childhoods and lives of ease and privilege in which they were not required to do any housework. I was spoiled, cherished, protected, and had an idyllic childhood. No one could have had a better childhood. It was a rich, good home. I didn't need to bother about nothing. I was spoiled, and it was beautiful. We were spoiled. We had maids, and we kids didn't need to do anything. And she, our mother, neither. Many enjoyed regular vacations to seaside and mountains. They skied in the winter and swam and played tennis in the summer. They had piano lessons, French governesses, attended the theater and the opera, wore the latest fashions, and anticipated futures of commensurate comfort. It's clear that most of these women could not have been less suited for the jobs that awaited them or less prepared to assume the position of diminished status their domestic service required. They were painfully aware that they were often better educated, better traveled, better dressed, more sophisticated, and more genteelly brought up than their British employers, throwing the disparity between their lives, their former lives, and their lives as servants into high relief. In their testimonies, they often speak at length about their own domestic staffs in Germany and Austria, and though these recollections are undoubtedly mediated by their own experiences of being in service, in their memories, their maids, governesses, and nannies were long-serving, loyal, and treated as part of the family. Marianne Silverman said, "My mother never did much work, and we had a lady in the house, but she was not named a maid. She was like a member of the family. She stood with us for all the years until she had to leave." Closeness with and kindness to their servants was often illustrated by descriptions of Christmas, which they emphasized was celebrated for the sake of their Christian domestic staff. Here's one example. We had the most loveliest Christmases with a Christmas tree, with the servants with us in the same room, with the grandparents and the present giving. And you can see they lived in quite a prosperous house. We don't know whether these German maids felt treated as part of the family in continental Jewish homes. But the important point is that the image of employer-servant relations that refugee domestics brought with them to Britain was their framework for understanding how servants were treated and shaped their reactions to their own treatment as servants in British homes. And what they said over and over in their testimonies was summed up most succinctly by Herta Grove. I was a real maid, not how our maids were in Germany, but I was a real maid. Part of the perception of being a real maid was the work they were required to do. Not only were most of these women unaccustomed to housework themselves, they experienced British housekeeping methods as extremely backwards and onerous. As Hannah Fishel noted in her diary, together we dusted downstairs, that is to say, we tidied up and wiped furniture and floor, the whole vast expanse. I wondered whether they knew about mops and was told yes, they realized mops and brooms existed, but wanted us to do it the way it had always been done, on our hands and knees. Fishel, who had a PhD in Slavic and Germanic languages from the University of Prague, had been a teacher at a prestigious gymnasium, and she dealt with the humiliations of servitude with ironic detachment, but firmly believed that her employers kept to traditional practices so that servants would know their place, which was literally on their knees. Another task that was almost uniformly commented on and detested was tending coal fires and boilers. Marianne Smith, whose wealthy employer managed to get a visa for Marianne's 56-year-old mother, said, "My mother couldn't manage it all. She was supposed to light a fire, never lit a fire. In those days, that was what you had to do, light fires in a boiler, and she had never seen anything like that in her life. We had central heating in Germany, and she was completely lost. My mother was quite useless at any of these things." Marianne was the upper housemaid in a large manor house, and her mother worked in a smaller home on the same estate. In order for her mother not to lose her job, Marianne would bicycle over to her mother's place several times a day to do all of her tasks while still fulfilling her own duties at the big house. The most odious and shocking task for refugee maids was mentioned by many, including Inga Adler. Another Jewish girl came 2 weeks after I was there. She was used to working, and we two always laughed about it. But when I was alone, I did not laugh. I didn't know that chamber pots existed. We all used a toilet in Germany. Aside from the loathsome and arduous physical labor, the other aspect of being a real maid was the treatment that Jewish refugees routinely reported receiving in British homes, which shattered the expectations formed by their childhood memories of maids. It should be noted that these employers treated their refugee maids in conformity to British standards of servant keeping, but the refugees had simply not been acculturated to these practices and found them extremely difficult to adjust to. Hildegard Hoffmann, who had been taken in as a mother's help for a young Jewish doctor's family in the East End, recalled, "I thought, isn't it wonderful? I'm going to meet everybody, and that's going to be like my adopted family. And all I did was serve. I wasn't included in anything." In addition to childcare, she was expected to keep the doctor's surgery clean, help in the kitchen, serve at the table, and do the rough, as the daily scrubbing and whitening of the front steps was called. Hoffmann, who had enjoyed what she described as a fairy tale childhood in an affluent family that employed a governess and 2 servants, told of visiting friends of her parents in Richmond on her day off. Quote, "I cried my eyes out and I told them how awful it was and that I have to do something to get back home. And they explained to me there was no such thing as going back home, that I had to try everything to get my parents out, but I can't go back home. One of the most depressing things was since I was a little spoiled Jewish princess, or maybe a big spoiled Jewish princess, I had never done any real what I would call rough labor. And in those early morning hours with this menial, horrible task to do, I cried my eyes out every morning, lying on my knees doing that." This quote sums up some of the strains that exile imposed upon these young women. There was the sheer drudgery of their work, their dawning realization of the loss of home, the pressure to save the lives of their families, the loss of social status, and the humiliations they endured by becoming maids. One of the most painful adjustments was the social isolation of maids in British homes. The separation of servants into basements, kitchens, and attics was entirely foreign in their own experiences of maids and cooks who lived with their families in single-floor flats in continental cities. Trudy Bibring said, "There was no social interaction. I sat in the kitchen. They sat in the lounge. I had my meals in the kitchen. They had their meals in the lounge. She would talk to me when she came into the kitchen. She was very friendly, very nice, but she would never say, 'Join us.'" And Marian Friedlander said, "They were very nice people, but a servant is a servant. A maid is a maid. The food that was left over at the table, I and the dog, Tinker was his name, was for us in the kitchen. My place was the kitchen. I sat in the kitchen crying, 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 and the dog was next to me, putting his paws on me and licking my tears. He was my best friend, that dog." These two testimonies likely reflect the most common experiences of refugee domestics. Working for employers they described as nice, in households in which they were not overtly mistreated, but still experiencing crushing loneliness and isolation. It's obvious that the despair described in these testimonies was still keenly felt when they were recorded 50, 60, or 70 years later. But paralyzing loneliness can also be found in the writings that refugee maids made at the time. Katie Cooperberg, a young woman of 24, set down her thoughts in a diary in early 1940 after she had been in England for about 9 months. Quote, "On Sundays when I was free, I walked about outdoors, but this didn't make me any happier. I walked down strange streets and heard the voices of strangers and thought about my loved ones and dear friends back home, feeling desperately alone, so that suddenly a terrible wave of homesickness constricted my heart and I burst out in tears. I felt ashamed to be crying there out in the open, but I had nobody I could pour my heart out to. To add to my woes were the increasingly strenuous tasks I had to perform in the household. I spent my days doing a great deal of hard work and feeling inconsolable. I cursed these rich people who didn't seem to have a shred of feeling or understanding for a single and unhappy woman. My friends and acquaintances from home should have seen me, how I was dressed up and polished when guests came to the house, a brown dress with cuffs and a little white apron and a dreadful little cap, which I hated. I would have loved to just run away the first time I was made to work in this apparel. Many similarly commented on the humiliation of these marks of servitude, but for others, the loss of status was the hardest to bear. Carola Domar said, "I had to clean toilets, make beds, serve at the table, and here I was, the daughter of a lawyer, growing up the way I did, as a maid. And again, that was extremely painful to me. I cried and cried and cried, but I had nowhere else to go at the time." The loss of position and autonomy was also keenly felt by older single women, many of whom had lived independently as businesswomen, teachers, secretaries, and the like, and for whom becoming maids produced notable psychological trauma. One of these was former office manager Ann Coleman, who came with her twin sister Lilo at the age of 30. "Most nights, but also during the daytime, I was continuously in tears. You come out of Germany and go as domestic to England as we did, where you had to swallow your pride quite a bit to do work which you at home had people who did it for you. To do it, it would take books to describe what pride I personally had to swallow." She also had a very dim view of her employer's motives. They thought they were doing something for the Jews. They themselves were Jews and showing me off as a refugee. I don't think it was kindness. It was more like, here, I'm doing something for the poor refugee from Germany. The adjustment which I had to do can't even be described in words. You were expected to say, "Thank you for letting me come to England to be alive." Many refugees expressed similar discomfort at being shown off as symbols of their benefactors' altruism and compassion, and these actions were more to those who did not feel sympathetically treated. The fact that Ann Coleman's employers were also Jewish added to her resentment, and in this, she was far from alone. From my research, it appears that at least 40% of refugee maids worked for one or more Jewish employer, And although there were exceptions, their descriptions of these jobs were strikingly negative. It certainly does seem the case that their sense of disappointment was heightened when they felt mistreated in the homes of co-religionists whom they likely believed would be more sympathetic to their plight. With surprising frequency, German and Austrian refugees stated the belief that poor treatment in Anglo-Jewish homes sprang from Ostjuden-Westjuden tensions. As Hildegard Hoffmann explained, quote, "After a week or two, I realized that during every conversation I had with the lady of the house, she told me that her family, before they immigrated to England, had a certain amount of time in Germany, and that the German Jews were so utterly unacceptable, they treated them so badly, and they didn't show them any hospitality. Little by little, it finally dawned on me that the feeling they had for anybody who was German Jewish was all negative and wrathful almost. And the reason that they had let me come over was to show me what a German Jew could be a very menial servant and being treated like maybe some of the Russian Jews had been treated. It was kind of a vengeance thing that had made them sign the paper. And when I realized that, it added an awful lot to my depression and homesickness." There is also a pervasive theme in these testimonies that Jewish refugees from fascism did not feel welcomed by Anglo-Jews and that they rarely mixed with them. Not coincidentally, among the group I have studied, at least 60% married other refugees, and for those who remained in Britain, former refugees remained their primary friendship group. Nevertheless, quite a few domestics reported finding sympathetic employers, both Jewish and non-Jewish, who treated them kindly and did not demand obsequious obedience. Herta Gertler had been a pampered only child, had never done any work at home, and felt, quote, terrible about becoming a servant, but said of her Jewish employers, "The people were pretty nice and I could eat at the table with them. I was like a member of the family and I loved the children, so it wasn't really that hard. I got accustomed to it." Herta remained with them until she emigrated to the United States, and she even named her first child Joyce, after the baby she can be seen holding in this photograph. Those who had truly sympathetic employers were aware of their good fortune, as this quote from Lily Schmetterling shows. Lily was an only child from a wealthy family and arrived at age 20 to work for an older couple in West Hyde. They were extremely nice, welcomed me, and made me feel at home. And while I was doing all the things a maid is supposed to do, like start the fire in the morning, they were extremely nice to me. They realized that I came from a good family and that this was a hard thing for me too. She was included in the family Christmas dinner with the extended family and noted, quote, "They never really made any difference about me being their maid," which was not the experience of some of my friends who went under similar circumstances. Some were really not treated well at all, so I was lucky. Another fortunate refugee was Susie Linton, whose parents desperately wanted her to take a job in a Jewish household, but who decided instead to work for a vicar in Liverpool. "I must say I was treated like a daughter in the house. I was beautifully treated. They wouldn't let me do any heavy work. I was like a daughter. I was sitting with them, eating with them. It was good." At the family's Christmas celebration in 1939, she recalled that the vicar's guests all, quote, "stood up and drank to the safety of my parents. It was very beautiful." Susie Linton lost this happy position when coastal areas were declared protected and all aliens forced to leave in the spring of 1940, when fears of a German invasion ran high and suspicion of aliens increased. She described the loss of this job as, quote, "terrible. It was another leaving. I was just getting sort of being happy under the circumstances with the family who became like my second parents. Even though I left them, I never lost contact with them because they were just truly wonderful people, and they were not even Jewish." The anti-alien panic of early 1940 caused a large wave of unemployment for refugee domestics. And this was on top of the first wave that had followed the declaration of war, when many employers let their refugee servants go, as Katie Cooperberg described. Quote, We had to go to Bloomsbury House every day to look after possible job positions, only to find out day after day that there were as good as no positions available for Germans. Instead, there were hundreds of unemployed girls who had been working in England for some time already and who were now overflowing Bloomsbury House. To have no hope of any work in the near future was devastating news. The English didn't want German girls in their homes and sent away the ones they'd had before. For a period after the war began, almost half of all the domestics in the country were receiving aid from Bloomsbury House. Katie also spoke of the despair being viewed with suspicion as an enemy alien instead of with compassion as a refugee. I began to feel really depressed. Why did I leave Germany only to become an enemy in another foreign land? Wasn't it sad enough to have to leave one's native land, parental home, and all one's friends because of that utter moron of a statesman, only because one belonged to the Jewish race? I was very unhappy. This terrible war had robbed me of every hope of once again leading a normal life and being able to look forward again. Immediately after war was declared, all aliens had to attend tribunals to be classed as friendly or enemy aliens. And in May 1940, about 3,000 refugee domestics who had received the latter classification were arrested and interned on the Isle of Man. Interestingly, few internees expressed bitterness about this experience. Those who first spent time in Holloway Prison were quite traumatized by that experience. But on the Isle of Man, they got a welcome reprieve from their hated domestic jobs, as Anne Coleman described. Quote, "To be quite honest, we had the best time of our lives because we went to the Isle of Man and the British government paid for everything. You had your food, you had your lodging. We were together with all our friends in one boarding house, all highly educated people who were domestic, and we were all together interned, and we had the most marvelous time. We went to the beach all the time. We swam for hours. We went home for lunch. We were only responsible for our own rooms." Internment also allowed them to avoid the Blitz. And one woman, whose employer, a tribunal judge who held the threat of internment over her head to compel obedience, remarked ruefully, quote, "Afterwards, I realized how lucky I would have been to go to an internment camp. I never was that fortunate because he exempted me from that. Those people had quite a good life. They never heard the sound of an air raid or a bomb coming down." Finally, classified as prisoners of war, they had more freedom to communicate with their families in Nazi-occupied Europe than they had had before or after, a privilege so precious that its loss devastated Marianne Rawson, pictured here with her parents in their villa outside Berlin. The minute I left the camp, I was not able to communicate with my parents anymore. No more prisoner of war mail. And that was the only reason I could, because of POW mail. So I couldn't, and I was very, very depressed. I remember that. I went completely out of my mind. I was in hospital for 3 months, and I imagined things. I had a nervous breakdown. That's what it was. For most, internment lasted about a year, and when they were released, they were free to take up war work in factories or other employment, as the government had lifted the requirement that they remain in domestic service in late 1940. I'd like to turn briefly now to the refugee domestics who were mothers with minor children in Britain, often sent separately on the Kindertransport. Though they were far more fortunate than women who had to send their children away and had no chance of reuniting with them, the situation was still extremely difficult for both refugee mothers and children. The first obstacle was arranging their own and their children's immigration. Once issued, a domestic service visa was only valid for a short period of time, and if their children's immigration had not yet been arranged, mothers had to make an agonizing choice: leave first and risk the unthinkable possibility that their children might not manage to join them, or delay their departure, possibly lose their visas, and be separated from their children forever. Lisa Orkin, a widow with 3 children, took the second option. When only her eldest 2 children were taken on the Kindertransport, she chose to remain with her younger son. who had no sponsor. Both Lisa and her son Leo were killed in the Shoah. In contrast, Selma Wheel left for Britain before her children, confident that she would be able to arrange for their immigration after she was settled. Marianne and Robbie were in a children's home in Amsterdam, awaiting transport to England when war broke out, and in a tragic twist of fate, were quarantined with chickenpox when the rest of the children in the home were hurriedly shipped to Britain. The Wheel children did not make it out of Holland and were murdered in the Holocaust, leaving their mother to grieve the consequences of her decision to leave her children behind when she came to Britain as a maid. For most of those who managed to get both themselves and their children to Britain, further hardships awaited. In general, employers were unwilling to allow their servants' children to live in their homes, and most families were separated, which caused tremendous heartache. Tina Mandel, who was supposed to have come as a domestic couple, was forced to flee alone with her toddler when Herman was arrested in Vienna. In a series of letters to friends, she wrote, "I worked hard without any payment just in order to be able to be together with the child. When I couldn't stay there any longer, I went to London. The committee insisted that I put the child into a home so that I would be free to work. The child, who was my only and greatest joy in this wretched existence, is now in a children's home." Hildy and Gerard could not keep their 18-month-old twins with them and were able to see them only once a month, bringing Hildy near a nervous breakdown. They quit their jobs and for a time were reunited with their babies, but when her husband was interned, she was forced to put the twins in, quote, the home for friendless children, while she worked as a domestic. Not allowed to see them during the week, she wrote of discovering the route the children took on their daily walk and hiding in the bushes along the way, quote, just to see them trotting along 2 by 2 as the tears ran down my cheeks. Annalise Goldschmidt, whose children were in boarding schools, wrote to their West London synagogue sponsors, "Life is terribly hard for me, and I cannot tell you how desperate I am. It is 2 years that I am separated from Hans and Marianne. I really cannot stand it near so long in domestic without a home and without my children." Goldschmidt's employers had grudgingly allowed her children to stay with her on school breaks, though she had to pay for their upkeep out of her meager wages. Thus, she was compelled to remain in domestic service in order to spend any time at all with her children. Trapped in jobs they despised with few financial resources, these women's maternal roles were almost entirely usurped by the refugee committees. The West London Synagogue records include interagency correspondence that characterizes these mothers as bothersome, hysterical, overly involved, and unhelpful. The refugee organization's paternalistic attitudes towards the refugee mothers and the belief that since they were paying for upkeep and schooling, they ought to make all the decisions regarding the children's care only increased the refugee domestic mother's sense of powerlessness and emphasized the pain of being dictated to, not only by their mistresses, but by the refugee organizations that sponsored their children. They were routinely told that they, quote, had nothing to complain of, and that they were, quote, in far more fortunate circumstances than most refugees. Powerfully silencing sentiments recognizable to many immigrants and involuntary exiles. It is obvious after listening to so many testimonies that many refugee domestics carried significant trauma for the remainder of their lives. Some had stories of sexual molestation, even attempted rape at the hands of their employers or other males in the household. Few reported these assaults, fearful of losing jobs or worse, being sent back to Germany. For many, their taped interviews decades later was the first time they had ever discussed these events. Overwhelming loneliness pervaded many of these interviews, and some reported having had nervous breakdowns, either during their term in service or much later. And of course, many lost their families, and these losses were especially devastating to those who had tried but were unable to bring their family members to safety. Alice Calder, who failed to obtain a visa for her mother, who was deported and killed in Riga, told her interviewer that she wrote a 6-page memoir and gave it to her children, quote, rather than talking to them in person. she admitted that her daughter, quote, would like to talk about it, but as you can see, she said through her sobs, I can't talk about it without crying, and I don't want to do that. Some admitted in their interviews that they had attempted suicide, including Carol Kuttner. It has to be said I was not treated nice. I was treated as I found somebody I can wash the floor with, like that, because I was utterly in her power, utterly. I was the most alone young lady you ever met. I was a very unhappy girl, more than unhappy. I wanted to forget the whole thing. By forget the whole thing, she meant life itself. And a few months later, she walked into the sea in an attempt to take her life, but was saved by a kindly stranger. She emigrated to America in 1940, but was once again forced to take up domestic work. I really still had nobody. I was totally alone, and people will take advantage of other people when they are totally alone. There's things here that none of my family know, so I don't know if I will ever tell. It was sad, okay? There were people I met that I now look back on, I say to myself, how could I have been so gullible? I was being used left and right, but I was just happy for anybody who could give me some comfort. Here she suggests that driven by overwhelming loneliness, she was sexually and emotionally exploited. Happily, she eventually found a partner and set up a house of her own. In a sentiment shared by many refugee domestics, she said, I worked no more in people's houses. I was out of people's houses. I was a human being again. I'd like to close by sharing my thoughts about why the experiences of Jewish refugee domestics are not widely known and why they have been forgotten in public memories and historical accounts of the period. I think the obvious point to be made is that it simply was not possible to weave a redemptive and uplifting story about saving 20,000 young lives from the Holocaust when their rescue was conditioned on a form of servitude that served the interests of middle and upper class Britons. As Lisa Hoffman said in the opening quote, it wasn't entirely altruistic of the English to do that. The Kindertransport, in contrast, did lend itself to such a narrative, even though, as my own research has shown, separation from and loss of families have traumatic consequences for many, if not most, Kindertransportees. Nevertheless, images of innocent children falling into the arms of strangers, motivated by altruism and compassion, have persisted, and an emphasis on those who have risen to the top, academically, politically, and socially, have helped to perpetuate the myth that they all made good and lived happily ever after. It is not possible to attach such narratives to refugee domestics, for everyone has a pretty good idea what life was like for servants in early 20th century Britain, and few could have any illusions about what awaited these refugees when they arrived to become maids, cooks, and nannies. Lisa Hoffman articulated another very important reason for the suppression of refugee domestic stories. Note that before opining on British immigration policies, she felt compelled to qualify her critique by saying, perhaps this doesn't sound very grateful. The imperatives of gratitude and indebtedness are routinely imposed on refugees and immigrants in every era and culture, and Jewish refugees from fascism were no exception. Anne Coleman recalled that when her employers came home to find her crying, they said, "What? Have you been crying again?" I had to kind of wash my eyes and contain myself, steel myself, not to let them see how you feel inside, because they felt, look what we've done for her. She should be eternally grateful. That the necessity to appear grateful above all else remained a powerful force 7 years later is evidenced by these letters to the editor of the AJR Journal in February 2009. In response to an article entitled Underpaid, Underfed, and Overworked, which exposed much of what I've discussed this evening, several former domestics wrote to complain and to insist, as one letter writer did, quote, better an abused domestic servant in England than a dead one in Auschwitz. My own research into the Kindertransport and refugee domestics has unequivocally demonstrated that this is the default position for former refugees, and that framing their own experiences against the fates of those who had to endure under the Nazis has the effect of suppressing and denying their own hardship and trauma. Herta Graham, who was mistreated and whose employer sexually assaulted her, nevertheless was extremely reluctant to admit her own suffering, saying, "Of course, it wasn't a happy life for me, but I feel ashamed to say it wasn't a happy life compared to what other people went through." This marginalization of their own painful experiences is part of a larger forgetting of refugee domestics in scholarship and public memory. Even the act of memorializing their life experiences on tapes often conveyed to them that their stories were less valuable than the stories of Holocaust survivors or even of their own family members who perished. Former refugee domestics have been silenced by imperatives of gratitude and sidelined by historical narratives that have elevated other refugee groups and Holocaust survivors' stories over their own, to the point that many are unsure where their experiences fit into the larger context of the Second World War and the Holocaust. One of these was Eva Feist. This is a page of testimony she filled out in 2006 for her mother, Clara, who was murdered in Theresienstadt. Eva had thought about trying to get her mother to England, but she hated her own job so much that she felt, quote, "How could I try to get a maid's job for my mother to get to England? The thought of my mother having to do what I had to do, having had maids herself before, I just couldn't get myself to expose my mother to treatment like that." Here, she all but admits that she felt responsible for her mother's death. There is a place on the form for the testifier to indicate whether or not they are also a Shoah survivor. Eva put an asterisk in that box and wrote on the bottom of the form, "In April 1939, I escaped to England as a maid. Do you consider me a Shoah survivor?" It is my hope that my research will reclaim Jewish refugee domestics' forgotten history, and to assure Eva Feist and all the others that whether or not they consider themselves survivors, their stories are important, their experiences are valid, and their suffering was real. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for that staggeringly interesting talk this evening. And there may well be people. You got time for a few questions?
Absolutely.
Okay. Before I do invite other people. There's just one question I'd like to put. You mentioned that that some of the women went to Jewish homes. That's kind of on the individual basis. My understanding is that the Jewish community didn't come out of this whole project with any great credit either. And it wasn't just Jewish homes, maybe, yes or no. There are a number of people on the call who also had a parent in Kitchener camp, which in some respect was a sort of a Jewish communal initiative itself. So is that a correct assumption? I mean, how did the Jewish community behave? 20,000 young Jewish women arriving in the United Kingdom. We had a note some while ago in the AJR magazine about how one particular community on the South Coast sat on its hands, as it were. I mean, was there a typical response, or is it just,
It's hard to say. I can't say that they acted in unison in any respect. Clearly, there were examples of Jewish families who did a lot to bring out as many people as they could. Often these people were related to them. I think if my impression from listening to over 300 testimonies and all of these memoirs and so forth is that the Jewish refugees felt quite unwelcomed by British Jews in general. And I wasn't entirely surprised by how many times this Ostjuden, Westjuden theme came up, because it came up from the Kindertransport research as well. But apparently there were powerful feelings on the part of people who had descended from Polish and Russian Jews against German Jews. So, and that, I think that was a strong theme in their relations. In addition, a lot of Anglo Jews weren't in a social strata to have a servant. Yet, so some of them did take in servants, but I mean, it's interesting to listen to those testimonies, because the refugee domestic came from a middle-class German home, and she's coming into quite a working-class Jewish home. And, you know, the woman doesn't even know how to treat a servant. And she comes with her trunks full of clothing because they weren't allowed to bring any money out. So the wealth that they could bring out was trunks full of linens and clothing. And there were a lot of tensions between mistresses and maids over, you know, this material wealth that they had. So I think it's a really very much many-layered thing. You can also, you know, I mean, there's wonderful stories of there's a lovely man on the South Coast named Eddie Sunshine who just went around. It's a perfectly wonderful name. He lived in Worthing, and he went around sort of rescuing domestics who were in unhappy situations. So it's not a totally grim picture, but it's very uneven.
Okay. Does anybody like to contribute? Anybody have a question? Or
I noticed there are a lot of people on this call whose relatives were domestics. Yeah,
absolutely. Yes, I'm coming to that in a moment. I've kept something of a tally.
I'm looking at this one comment, and I will comment on this. This comment is the Jewish community wasn't interested. My mother wrote to the nearest shul to ask for help with accommodation for Yom Kippur, and they were completely ignored. This is a common theme. They felt very unwelcome in the established religious communities. Very, very unwelcome. So that was a very common experience.
Okay, anybody?
David, Stephen Nelson here.
Stephen, yes, hi, hello. Welcome back to Kenton, Barbara.
Thank you very much. Always lovely to come back to Kenton.
One of the times I'm almost embarrassed to say she was a member of the youth service when we go to Kenton.
I was indeed. Lovely it was.
Stephen.
Yeah. Jennifer, thank you very much. It's been a very, very interesting talk. My late mother came over as a domestic servant in March 1938 from Vienna. And she came to live in St. Albans. And my understanding from what she told me was that she was very, very well looked after. She was a domestic servant in a very nice family. And in fact, the lady of the house was instrumental in providing references for my mother's two sisters and also her parents to be able to come out of Vienna and come to England, where my mother, my two aunts and my grandmother, I think, were domestic servants in or around that area. And I think maybe because my mother didn't come from such a rich family, if I can use that expression, her parents had a cafe house in Vienna. And so my mother told me that she was quite used to having to stay up to midnight to wash the dishes, etc. And she was also, she became a court dressmaker in Vienna. So therefore she had a profession or a job or something that she could do, which is something that she started to do evenings and weekends to be able to eventually, together with her sisters, find a house. And they lived in Harpenden. And when she finished being a domestic servant, she then did some war work at the Vauxhall factory in Luton, putting manufacturing or helping to manufacture pipes for aircraft. And I think she had generally quite a good experience, so to speak.
Yeah, you bring up some interesting points. First of all, there were wonderful families who did that, you know, who just, once they had the domestic in the house, they did everything they could to try and help them get their families out. There are also the flip side, testimonies where they tried everything and couldn't get a single person to sponsor their parents. So there were, you know, both sides of that story. And, you know, we also have to look at the other side of the picture. These women, a lot of them admit in their testimonies that they were terrible maids, you know, not because they weren't trying, but, you know, they had no skills and they didn't know the way the English did things. And they were horrible at building fires and they didn't know how to make British tea. And they said they could cook and they really couldn't. So you know, I'm sure the employers were not thrilled with a lot of them. Although some of them said if I'd been treated more nicely, I would have probably been a better maid. And, you know, who knows? Some of these women might have come out with some attitude. We just really don't know what those interactions, unless we would get the other side of the story. And I've never found any kind of testimony or record from the employer's point of view. There are a few letters I've seen that were references that were kind of not very nice references, you know, where they tried to find something nice to say about this person that hadn't worked out. But, you know, I think there were all the usual mismatches of foreigners and the British and then going to war. And then there was a lot of just undifferentiated, well, you speak German, you're German, we're at war with Germans, just like that quote from Katie Cooperberg. So there were multiple levels on which the maids and their employers could clash. So it's wonderful to hear that you know, you have a good story to tell. It's always good to hear those.
Jennifer, we've got a question here from Judith Gordon on the chat, who's asking about the involvement of the Quaker movement in this rescue. Her mother was sponsored by a Quaker family, she says, and was very well treated. And she's interested to know what the Quaker involvement was in all of this.
The Quakers come up a lot in testimony. The Quakers were very active on the continent. They worked very closely with Jewish organizations in Vienna and in various places in Germany. And so they were a point of contact even, you know, before they came here. A lot of women went to work for Quaker families, and it's almost 100% positive, their experiences with Quakers. So the Quakers were deeply involved in all aspects of Jewish refugee work, with kindertransportees, with domestics. I read the minutes of a Quaker group in Edinburgh, and they up in Edinburgh, this group of Quaker women formed their own domestic bureau, and they just brought domestics over and put them in Quaker households. And so, yes, there were a lot of Quakers, and the experiences of those women were generally quite good.
We have another question, which is a kind of an elementary, obvious question, isn't it? I mean, what languages did these people speak to each other? Sandra's asked about whether the girls spoke English or whether the family spoke German. I mean, how did they communicate?
Well, you know, most of them didn't speak German. Language obviously is something that's addressed quite specifically in the testimonies. Some of these women spoke a little bit of English, or thought that they spoke a little bit of English from school, and then when they got here realized that they didn't. The most interesting testimonies are those who actually thought that they spoke or understood English and ended up in Scotland and couldn't understand a single thing. Or a woman who went to a lovely family up in the Potteries, but they also had a very strong dialect that she literally could not understand. So even if they could speak some kind of English, sometimes they ended up somewhere where they couldn't understand what was being said. Most of them say that, you know, they learned English pretty quickly. A few of these employers, especially if they'd had foreign domestics for a while, maybe spoke a little bit of German. Certainly in some of the Jewish households, they spoke Yiddish, although not very many of the domestics spoke Yiddish themselves, and that could be a cause of tension in those households if they didn't speak Yiddish. So yeah, it was a real mixture. And a lot of them say how difficult it was for them. Katie Cooperberg's letters are very interesting because she kind of, in her diary, she kind of lays out, all the struggles that she had with English and with making herself understood and so forth. A lot of them talk about having these little pocket dictionaries. And I actually interviewed one woman, and she was 94, and she'd been a domestic with her sister, older sister, and she still had this little tiny pocket dictionary that she took everywhere with her. So.
Yeah, somebody's actually made that comment. Kathy was saying her mother went to a family who got a Hungarian English dictionary to assist. That must have been fun. Do you want to?
I was just going to a basic question, really. Were most of the refugees met? Most of them arrived at Harwich. Were they met and taken to Bloomsbury House? I don't know if you know that answer, but also I've been looking at some of my mother's papers, and all that time when she was really unhappy, and she was writing letters to the Help the Deportees Committee and trying to send food parcels to her parents. And she was sending 15 shillings, which I think was actually the amount that they were paid per week.
That's right.
By the families. And it's just really sad. And today, only today, I noticed that she was sending a food parcel to Theresienstadt. And I wish I'd seen that the address is actually on this little piece of paper. I would have gone to see exactly where her
parents lived. Yeah,
I just felt really sad. But
and they did not survive.
Pardon?
Her parents.
Her mother was then sent to Treblinka, but there is a letter from the Help the Deportees Committee. I think that's the committee, and it says, we've found your father. And it's given a Max Cohen, and where he was found in Switzerland, and it's not her father, it's a different date of birth completely.
Yeah.
It's really sad, all these things. And they're dealing with all this and being treated very badly at the same time. Just find it sad.
Actually, I looked at the first set of papers. I didn't look at that second set. Did you notice on her papers that she came on a green card?
Yes, what I sent you today, I think. Actually.
Yeah, and did you know what that meant?
No.
So I'm sure you heard in the talk, that meant that she was given, a visa without a guaranteed job. So
right.
she did come to Harwich, I noticed on her papers.
Yeah.
Generally, I think there were always someone from Bloomsbury House that met the boat train, the boat, and took them on the train. Yeah. Because the ones that came on the green card they were compelled to register at Bloomsbury House and surrender their green card and then start looking for a job right away. They generally put them up for a few nights in a hostel or the Jews temporary shelter, something like that, until they could find work. There are many, many stories of women, though, that were supposed to meet someone and no one was there to meet them. And one of the reasons is there are also many, many stories of being taken off the train at the border and being strip searched and being harassed, specifically by German guards, right? Because it's the last chance that they could harass them, but specifically to try to make them miss the train. So a lot of them missed their train, and then they had to wait for the next train, and then whoever was going to meet them, they were not there. And so there was a lot of trauma right around just arriving, because the journey was traumatic and then these things happened. So it really varied in terms of, how they got settled when they first got here.
I sometimes think that the older refugees that came over were more traumatized than maybe some of the younger ones. I don't know if that's true, but my mother had nightmares all her life, and she used to wake us up when we were little. We used to go running in, and that didn't stop.
I would suspect that a lot of these, just like the children, I think, as I said in my talk, I mean, my sense is that a lot of them carried trauma their whole lives. And I mean, age does matter to a certain extent. You might think that the younger women were a little more adaptable. I think that that's probably true. But I think you also have to look at other factors, like the older, slightly older women, you know, they had been uniquely disadvantaged by the rise of Hitler, because everything that they might have thought that they were going to do with their lives, they couldn't do, right? So their lives were derailed long, well, not the Austrian ones, but certainly the German ones, long before they came to England. So, you know, there's a lot of points along the way where you can see that trauma comes into the story.
And just sorry, can I just say one quick thing? She was sent to Bodmin Moor in Cornwall, which might explain because she's the only Jew in the village. Some things.
Of course,
it didn't help much. Sorry, thank you.
I'm sure you're aware of this, but Rosalind has mentioned something from the Birmingham Jewish community where some research was done.
Yes, I have this book. It is really fascinating. One little frustration for me is she anonymized a lot of the testimonies. I've often wanted to see her actual testimony transcripts, but nobody seems to know if they're archived somewhere. So, but yeah, it's a really great book.
It's interesting because Eric Elias has asked for a reading list. Well, he hasn't put it that way, but he said any published reference works to study. So maybe
well, as I said, Tony Kushner, so he wrote a chapter and a couple of articles in 1990. And then he kind of put the domestics aside for 30 years. His most recent book, called Journeys from the Abyss, covers the domestics in a kind of literary analysis way. I've actually published two articles, well, an article, a chapter, and another article I've just sent in. So there, I mean, I've published a little bit, and I am working on the book. Yeah. If you're German, there is a German book by a woman named Trudy Boloff. It was her PhD dissertation, and it's about Jewish refugee domestics. Her focus is a little different than mine. Of course, she's looking at it really from a German perspective. And she spends about half the book talking about German women going to England. So how the Jewish exodus was a sort of follow on from that. But honestly, there is not much on refugee domestics that's been published.
Jennifer, can I say something, please, about the actuality? In Birmingham, Zoe Josephs did all the recordings. My mother was one of many people who wrote out the actuality. So it must actually be somewhere. Now,
I think that they must be, but I have never been able to find out where.
But I made a radio documentary of survivors in Birmingham in the late 1960s, 70s. Wow. Spielberg and all these people. Mm-hmm. I was young, I was a teenager, but I thought this was important. And that is now in the Birmingham City Archives.
Oh, okay.
And the Birmingham City Archives were doing at the time 150 or 160 years of Birmingham Singers Hill and the Birmingham Jewish community. So there is lots of stuff there in the archives, and I'm wondering if that's where that actuality has gone.
It could be. That was my last thing I was going to do this year. Visit some various archives. I needed to visit some archives in London and other places, and obviously that did not happen. So
okay, maybe I can phone them for you if I can find the contact.
That would be great. My email was on the first page of that, but you can get in touch with me through David. That would be fine. That'd be great.
This is a national broadcast. Danny in Manchester, did you want to ask a question?
Yes, please. Yes. First of all, Jennifer, thank you very much for your very interesting lecture. And a lot of the experiences you related about the refugee domestics, they remind me a lot of what my mother told me. She would have been 110 now, had she? Wow. She died when she was grand old age of 96, but she was a domestic, and I came over with her. I think we must have caught the last boat from Hamburg to Harwich on August 31st. And we went to Bloomsbury, and from there we went to Kitchener Camp, where we joined my father on the 2nd of September. That's the day before war was declared. And the thing is, she'd come on a domestic visa, and I think she'd had help from the Quakers. Anyway, she got this post in Didsbury, Manchester. She worked for the French consul, who had a Russian wife. And she said, she always told me that she had been treated like a slave. They lived in a large 8-bedroom Victorian house, and she was not only required to cook, but also clean the house as well. She literally worked from 6 in the morning till midnight.
And where were you?
Now, I had to, she had to find a home for me, a foster home, and that was done with the help of the Quakers. So I can certainly confirm for Judith Gordon that the Quakers helped her to find me a post. She'd written many, many letters to all over the world, and one of them landed on the desk of a lady in Manchester Friends Meeting House. It's still there today, and it was from it was this lady who was Mrs. Schaefer, and she read the letter. My mother had asked during this letter, or begged someone to find a post for me. At the time, I was only, well, I spent my 4th birthday in Kitchener Camp, and what happened then, she saw that I needed a foster home, and she read it and she said, "Hey, I know this family, I know the name, Herman." So she put the letter on the notice board, and sure enough, that very same day, there was a couple who came in from a Cheshire village who were looking to foster a refugee child, and she was able to recommend me. And I must have looked very sad on the picture. Anyway, they fell in love with me, and I went to live with them. So that's how the Quakers helped my mother to get a place for me. And she was only allowed to visit me, I think, twice in the first 6 weeks we were there. Eventually, she had to. Oh, the other thing about my mother, she was an excellent cook. Her specialities were goulash. She had a fantastic recipe for apple pie. And of course, we came from Königsberg, now known as Kaliningrad, and the delicacy of that town, I don't know if you've heard of them, are Königsberger Klopse. They're meatballs. I believe the traditional type of meatball is fried, but this was boiled, I think. But it's well known today even. Yeah. So she had these great culinary skills, and the consul and his wife, being in that position, they had to do a lot of entertaining, and the guests used to wander into the kitchen to compliment the chef. And of course, the Russian lady hated this. She thought that was terrible because she was trying to claim credit for all the recipes. But that's
yeah. In the book, I think I'm going to have to put a whole chapter or subchapter about food, because food comes up a lot in these testimonies, because a lot of these women were expected to cook, and then their reactions to British food, and how many of them won their employers over to continental food. Some of them never managed to do that, but the food aspect is a really fascinating one.
The only other thing I wanted to mention was that I think I'm probably one of the last surviving members of the Kitchener camp.
Yeah. They have put together a website for Kitchener camp. It's another one of those kind of under researched and not very well known aspects of the refugee experience. It is interesting to me that a number of domestics had husbands in the Kitchener camp, because of course I don't know about your own father, but a lot of those men had been arrested on Kristallnacht, and they would be released from prison on the condition that they left the country within 2 weeks. And the Kitchener camp was a place where they could go. But they had some freedom in the Kitchener camp, and some of these men were successful in arranging for domestic jobs for their wives. And so some women got their domestic service permits through their husbands who were already in the Kitchener camp.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I don't know if Claire's still here, but certainly Claire Ungson, who was sort of the Kitchener camp historian, was on this call, certainly at the beginning. I don't know if she still is. But Stephen Nelken, the moving spirit behind the creation of the website, is on this call. I can see him here.
Excellent. Yeah, I think it's a great effort. I don't have a tremendous amount to contribute to the Kitchener camp because my refugees have been children and women who didn't spend a lot of time there. But there is this connection of men going out into the community when they could and trying to find domestic positions for their wives.
I've just been advised by Claire, she is indeed here, and her publicity officer, Stephen Nelken, suggested we all go and buy her book.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Is indeed money very well spent. We have a copy here. Okay, any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question.
Let's make the last question. Simon, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, hello, Simon.
What was
an international meeting?
International.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Simon, what was the main motivation for the Germans to allow these people to leave in 38 and 39?
They didn't mind anybody leaving. I mean, they were happy to see them go. They didn't try to keep them in Germany. They made it as difficult as possible in terms of squeezing as much money as they could out of them before they left. For instance, many testimonies talk about how, as I mentioned, they couldn't take money out. But they could take belongings, any amount of belongings. Some of them talk about packing a whole, what they call the lift, which would have been a considerable number of trunks. But in order to get this stuff out, they had to have the customs man come and watch them pack everything. And then they sealed these trunks. And they had to make a declaration of everything they were taking and when it was bought and what its value was. And if it was used, they didn't have to pay customs on it. But if it was brand new, they had to pay twice its value in a customs. So there were these issues. They did have to get an exit visa. They had to prove that they had no police record or didn't owe any taxes or anything like that. But in terms of then letting them go, once they'd gotten as much money as they could out of them, that wasn't really an issue. It wasn't really until 1941, early 1941, that they really closed the doors completely, because I know that some of the Kindertransport children's parents got out of Germany in late 1940 and early 1941, which rather surprised me. And there was only one route out. They had to go out through Russia, but they could still leave Germany if they had a valid visa somewhere. So yeah, leaving wasn't really, they weren't trying to keep them in Germany or, Greater Germany.
Okay, that was one of the last questions. We're going to have two more last questions.
Okay, that's fine.
Then we'll call it a day. One is somebody was asking on the chat whether the Spielberg Foundation had any hand in supplying any evidence for the domestics.
Well, out of 200 or so of the 300 testimonies I've listened to came from the Spielberg collection. Okay. By far, that's the biggest collection. And I briefly mentioned in passing, it's an invaluable resource for sure, but I briefly mentioned in passing that one of the things that has silenced refugee domestics is that a lot of the testimony gathering has not valued the refugee experience. And I cannot tell you how many times in those 200 testimonies, a domestic would get to the point in her story where she's about to talk about her experience as a domestic, and the interviewer will redirect her back to something else. What was happening with your family? What was their fate? They were constantly being given the message, the subtle message that your story is not too important. What we really want to find out is, you know, how did your family members die, or how did they survive? So with that caveat, I say it's a really great resource. The testimony collection that is by far the best in terms of really mining the domestic service experience is the AJR's Refugee Voices. And of course, you know, that's what they're about, trying to find out what the refugee experience was. But I have found this in other testimony collections. Yad Vashem, terrible. Like, they didn't, once they left Germany as a refugee, they didn't really want to know anything about what happened. So there are some definite limitations in these testimonies for sure.
And one now to the final last question. I heard somebody saying that Brenda wanted to ask a question. I can't see you, Brenda.
I'm there. It's Arthur.
Oh, you're there. Ha, I can see you. Yes.
Not,
the last question is with you.
It's not really a question. It's a comment. I want to speak to Rosalind sometime about what happened in Birmingham, because I have time. But I've got just talking about generally kinder transport. Where am I?
Can you say I can't see that?
Yes, it's the policeman smiled. And I would hope that you would read this one instead. Because the book, The Policeman Smiled, has a really definite narrative that I challenge really strongly in my book. Yeah.
I don't want to, more or less finish now, but I'd like to just comment on kinder transport. There were some wonderful stories, and I'd like to remind people about a wonderful family, Richard and David Attenborough's.
Of course, yes.
How wonderful they were.
Absolutely. I mean, there were some real heroes in all these stories for sure. And we can't forget them. But we need to hear everybody's stories as well.
At one point I was going to say, I don't know any facts, but I did know during the Blitz, when I was a small boy, we did have a young woman, probably about 20 years old, who had left Austria in 1938, 1939, staying with us during the Blitz for a few months.
Huh, interesting.
And she was sleeping in a divan bed, and the Luftwaffe got and destroyed it with an incendiary bomb.
Thank you, Jennifer. That's I just want to thank you and for a really, really, truly riveting evening. And that's the
thanks. I appreciate it.
The third time I've heard that talk or variations of it. And I have to tell you, it really does not lose its impact, and I could quite happily sit through it for a full.
Well, can I just say, anybody who had a relative, if they have documents that they would be willing to share with me, I would love to see them. Documentary evidence is not so easy to come by, especially since I can't get to an archive right now. You have my email, so they can all contact me through you. I would be happy to email with anybody if they have any follow-up questions or comments or anything else.
Just reflecting on that. On the whole, you might say that's not a very cheerful tale. On the other hand, we have had at its peak 103 screams this evening.
Wow, that's great.
Of those 103 screams, 21 or 22 or so have a relative, on the whole a mother, and sometimes an auntie as well as a mother, who were on these domestic visas. So put another way, you know, this is the festival of Hanukkah, this is the festival of light. 1 in 5 of those screams roundabout could well not be here were it not.
This is true. This is true. I mean, this is why Lisa Hoffman said, you know, despite everything, it did save my life for sure. Yeah.
So once again, really, I realize you've had a a long haul at this today, and I apologise to everybody for the hanging around and the waiting. I'd like to think, however, the waiting is worth it. Thank you once again.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It was lovely speaking to you all, and I hope you have the rest of a lovely Hanukkah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you
I think
very much. I'll give you.
Thank you.
as host,
Thank
you
you.
can
Thank you.
close it down. Over to you.
Monica, what's her name, is one of the Kitchener descendants.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Look up Kitchener.
Rochelle, you have the power to send us all on our way.
Thank you very
Thank
much
you.
indeed, David. Tremendous. It
Thank
really
you.
was.
Thank you.
Fascinating. Thanks very much.
Thank you for lighting the candles for us.
Yes, it was lovely.
Everyone's unmuted.
And thank you for Mount
Unmute yourselves now.
Thank you.